A Christmas Fairy Tale. Once upon a time there was a poor student who was quite lonely and alone, and had no one in the wide world to take care of him, and he would have loved so much to have someone he could have loved so deeply. Sometimes, on the beautiful summer nights, when the moon was shining, he sat at the open window of his little garret and looked out over the roofs of the great city as they lay in the moonlight, and then he thought, if a heart would beat for him once more under these roofs, if he would find someone else in this great wide city who loved him so much, and whom he could love so much from the bottom of his heart, and the moon shone full on his face, and the stars flashed brightly down. In the distance stood the tall church towers, dark and silent, and the rolling and roaring of the great city came up to him, the great city in which he was so quite alone. He was very industrious and probably worked all day. When evening came, he hurried through the hustle and bustle of the city into the open air, and rejoiced in the merry games of the children and the merry walkers, or sought a lonely place to indulge his thoughts undisturbed. One day in the summer, as he was walking through the streets at dusk, a man met him with a dog-cart. He was a very strange man. He was not tall and a bit hunchbacked, and wore a long, grey coat with large pockets in it. A large black hat with a broad cramp covered his little grey bearded face, so that if he wanted to look at anyone with his deep-set dark eyes, he had to put his head back completely. With his long buttoned coat and broad-brimmed hat, he looked almost like a giant mushroom. His dog was grey and long-haired, with clever eyes. The man left his cart in the street and went into the houses, for he bought rags, bones, and all such things that no one could use. Herman was just watching the grey man go into a house when a street boy arrived and teased the poor grey dog, who could not defend himself with a stick. When the dog growled and barked and snapped at the stick, he even began to beat him, enjoying the whining of the poor animal. Herman fell into a violent rage at this, snatched the stick out of the boy's hand, and beating him heartily with it, said, "Just wait, you shall feel how it does." The grey man had just stepped out of the door again and asked Herman to stop. "Just let the boy go, he certainly won't do it again," he said. Herman let go of the roaring and quite bewildered boy and stroked the dog, which gratefully licked his hand. The old man, however, looked at the poor student very kindly, shook his hand, and said, "I will remember you for that. Come, bellow." Herman heard the old man and his bellow drive on, so that he murmured to himself, "I will remember him for that," and Bellow wagged his tail as if he wanted to say the same thing. Herman often met the ragpicker in the street, then they nodded kindly to each other, and Bellow jumped and barked for joy. Summer passed, autumn came, soon the first snowflakes fell, and then came the beautiful Christmas season. But the poor student had no one who would have given him anything, no one who remembered him that evening. On Christmas Eve, when it was getting dark, he wandered through the streets of the city, through the hustle and bustle of the Christmas market, and was quite sad and alone. He turned into a dark alley. It hurt him so much in the hustle and bustle. Then he suddenly heard himself called, and saw the old grey man standing at the door of a dilapidated house. Bellow sprang happily to meet him. "Come in," said the man. "Today, I want to be your Santa Claus." He led him into a small, warm room. A lamp stood on the table, and in front of it lay an open Bible. On the walls were all kinds of objects, arranged on borders, useful and unusable things, glasses and books, cooking utensils and old pictures, broken pots, and 1,000 other objects such as can be found in a junk dealer's shop. Herman and the old man sat down at the table. He put on large, horn-rimmed glasses and read the Christmas Gospel with a trembling voice, Herman sat reverently and listened, and Bello pricked up his ears and looked at his master as cleverly as if he understood everything. The trembling voice of the old man, however, rose more and more, and he concluded clearly and distinctly with the saying of the angels, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth, and goodwill to men." Then he rummaged around in an extract and brought a bottle of wine and a large cake. "Now we will celebrate Christmas," he said, "and eat cake and drink wine. Today, all the world is eating cake, and Bello is getting some too. We shall like that, don't Bello?" He poured the wine into 2 sparkling cut crystal glasses and asked Herman to drink. What did that smell like? How fiery. The blood rolled through his veins. It seemed to him as if the wine were evaporating on his tongue. He thought he was drinking nothing but spirit. How different the poor chamber of the junk dealer seemed to him now. Precious vases and magnificent glass vessels, which he had previously thought were broken pots, shimmered on the walls. In the nooks and crannies, there was a mysterious rustling and scurrying. Sometimes it seemed to him as if bearded dwarf heads were peeping out from behind the mighty gold-decorated books, or peeping out of the colourful vases. But when he looked more closely, there was nothing unusual to be seen. The old man had put on a brightly coloured dressing gown and a high pointed cap so that he looked like a magician. "Now let's look at pictures," he said, laying a large tome on the table. Then he opened the book and touched the pictures with a colourful stick. It was as if everything came alive, how it lived and teemed. That was a Christmas market. There were shops with toys and colourful pyramids. How the lights shimmered. People went and bought. There were also fir trees there. A poor woman had bought a very small Christmas tree. Her 2 little children had taken hold of her dress and were very happy. Now they too received a Christmas tree. Herman thought he heard the shouting of the salesman and the plaintive sounds of the barrel organ. Weren't people confused? It wasn't a picture. It was all alive and really. "Turn over," commanded the old man, and Herman thought he saw a dwarf under the paper, which turned over quickly and then disappeared as if it had crept into the picture. It was a sea storm. How the waves surged and foamed. A ship danced on the waves, the water splashed over the deck. It was a Christmas Eve on the sea. On the leeward side, sheltered from waves and wind, sailors sat and smoked and chatted with each other. With his arm wrapped around the mast, however, stood the brown ship's boy, unconcerned about wind and weather. Was it salt water, or was it tears wetting his face? Now his brothers and sisters jumped around the green shining fir tree. Now his mother thought of him and wept and prayed for her son. On the wide, wild sea, it was Christmas Eve, and he was still so young. Another leaf was opened. That was a merry company. On the table stood a fir tree with many lights. Students sat around the table and drank punch. They also wanted to celebrate Christmas in their own way. On the Christmas tree hung all kinds of foolish things, children's flutes, jumping jacks, and funny dolls with big heads. Underneath lay paper, and baskets stood around. Then they had unpacked what had been sent to them from home. There had been letters and gifts from parents and dear relatives, and woolen stockings and many peppernuts. One of them had taken hold of a sausage and looked at it, as if to say, "Well, I should like you." There was also one sitting a little to one side. He had a brightly embroidered wallet in his hand and kissed it secretly, and it was as if Herman heard the clinking of glasses and merry laughter. Now he saw a sad picture. The father was on his deathbed. The mother had put her hands under his head and held him to see his children once more. They stood around the bed and wept. There was also a little blonde curly head who wept quite pitifully. But he probably did not weep for his father, for his little mind did not yet understand what it meant to die. He cried because he was not allowed to laugh and jump, and because he was not to have a fir tree like the other children. And that is a great sorrow. And the leaves were turned over, and Herman sat and looked and forgot everything around him, and laughed and wept for joy at all the glorious things that showed themselves to his eyes. The images became more and more vivid. It seemed to him as if he were looking into a frame into the real world. When the book was finished, the leaves rustled and grew and spread. Green fir branches shot up between the leaves, higher and higher, and bright sparks sprayed between them. It crowded out of the walls, green and merry. The ceiling grew, higher and higher. It was as if the fir branches were pushing them apart. Lights flickered on the branches, and from the floor sprouted mighty flowers with closed buds. They opened themselves with a sweet fragrance, and merry figures floated out with delicate little wings. They flew gracefully through the air, and when Herman looked up, a mighty fir tree had grown out of the leaves of the book with 1,000 bright lights. The bright figures hovered around him and fluttered and played between the green branches. Herman now noticed that he was quite alone. Suddenly, however, the fir branches parted from each other, and a beautiful girl came forward in a white dress with a spruce wreath in her hair. She took Herman by the hand, and they climbed up the mighty fir tree as if by a spiral staircase. Herman did not dare to speak. He felt so solemn, and the girl was so beautiful. It always seemed to him as if he heard in the distance the mighty tones of an organ and the singing of devout people. They climbed higher and higher. Sometimes he saw through the branches the dark night sky with its twinkling stars. At the top, however, he suddenly looked out over the whole city. The houses shone and shone in the Christmas splendor, and cheerful voices came up to him. "Look up," said the girl, and he saw a white mist in the sky, which suddenly tore asunder, and it was as if he were looking into the middle of the sky. Then angels in white robes floated up and down in bright clouds, carrying palm branches in their hands, and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth, and goodwill to men." "But it's high time you went home now," the old junk dealer's voice suddenly snarled in his ear. "It's almost midnight." And there he sat at the table again, and everything looked quite ordinary. The book was gone, and the old man was rummaging in a drawer. "You slept very well, I suppose," he said now. "Did I dream?" said Herman, quite confused. "Go to bed, you are tired," said the old man, "and here I will give you something too, which a diligent student can use." With that, he pressed an old, strangely shaped writing instrument into his hand and pushed him out of the door. And when Herman staggered home through the gaslit streets, it was like a dream to him. When Herman awoke late the next morning, he thought he had dreamed everything. But then he saw the writing utensils standing on the table, which the old man had given him. All the colourful pictures passed before his mind, which he had seen the previous evening. He got up and looked out of the window. Snow had fallen during the night. There were all the white roofs in the sunshine, the sky was clear, the sparrows were chirping, and the air was full of bells. That was a beautiful Christmas day. When Herman went to church, he saw the children playing with their new toys at the windows. They all had new Christmas clothes on, and happy eyes and happy faces. In front of a front door stood a very little girl with her older sister. In one hand she had a doll, in the other a pepper-nut. "There, man," she said, holding out the pepper-nut to Herman. How she laughed happily when Herman really took her and went on gratefully. Christmas Day came to an end. Herman sat alone at the table in his little room. The lamp shone comfortably and the fire burned merrily in the iron stove. He had a sheet of white paper in front of him and looked thoughtfully at the writing utensils. It was delicately made of metal, and in it was a sand barrel, a clay barrel, and a container for steel springs. Dainty tendrils, formed by open-work foliage, gracefully interwoven, formed the frame. Between the leaves sat cute lizards, beetles, and butterflies. Dwarf figures with bearded faces peeped out of the tendrils here, and light elves leaned forward with half their bodies out of the flowers. Yes, sometimes it seemed to Herman as if everything was alive and moving in confusion. But then everything was rigid and stiff again. In the middle, however, as in a small grotto, sat under the leaves a fine, dainty girl, with a little crown on her head and a chopstick in her hand. It was so finely and delicately worked that Herman could not take his eyes off it. He felt as if he had to write. As he dipped the quill into the ink barrel, he felt a slight blow and a twitch in his fingers, and now he saw distinctly. One of the dwarfs nodded to him, and now the others too, and then all was life and movement. The vines expanded and grew and spread across the table. Magnificent blossoming trees shot up into the air, sending climbing branches and flowery loops in all directions. The dwarfs came out and disappeared again among the vines. Delicious flowers, red, white, and blue, opened up. An elf floated out of each and then fluttered into the tangle of flowers. Up to the ceiling, everything was now full of flowers and leaves and dainty tendrils. Butterflies trickled in between. Large, shiny beetles crawled on the stems, and dazzling lizards slipped through the flowery threads. Then the branches parted from each other, sweet, merry music sounded, and out of the tangle of flowers came a strange procession. In front, bearded dwarfs with flashing golden trumpets, curved horns, small timpani, and lovely flutes. Then other dwarves followed, in golden shining armour, riding huge stag beetles. They carried small lances in their hands, and it was ridiculous to see how gravely they sat on their brown horses, and how the fat beetles, with their 6 legs, tried to march to the beat. Behind them came a light band of elves, marching with pointed hats, carrying sharp blades of grass as swords in their hands. But they were a little mixed up, because the elven people are much too windy to march properly. Now silver bells rang, and dainty white fairy girls danced up, little bells on swaying stems in their hands, and then followed on a throne braided with flowers, carried by 12 elves, a beautiful girl in a white fragrant dress, with a golden crown on her head, and a white stick in her hand. To the side walked grey-bearded dwarves in flickering scaled armour, armed with shiny halberds. Above the throne and behind it, swarming around it on all sides, merry, nimble elves cavorted on magnificent butterflies. They carried flashing lances in their hands, as fine and shining as a ray of sunshine. Then followed again girls with bells in their hands, then a crowd of merry elves, and at last came black-bearded dwarfs with turbans and crooked sabres, ridden on nimble lizards. The throne was placed in the middle, and the motley crowds lined up on either side of it, except for the light butterfly riders, who swarmed merrily in the air on their brightly coloured horses. Now the musicians blew 3 thunders, and all the dwarves and elves shouted hurrah 3 times with their fine voices, as loud as they could. Then the girl rose from her seat, bowed 3 times to Herman, and said, "My lord and lord, will you allow me and my people to have a feast here tonight?" "Who are you?" asked Herman, quite confused by all the marvellous. "I am the fairy tale," said she, "and thy pen below, gracious master." And Herman nodded his head, for he did not know what to say to it. Then the merry crowd formed a semicircle, which remained open on the side where Herman was sitting. The elves and dwarfs sat on the ground, behind them the elf girls on a hill, in the middle the queen. The stag beetles and the lizards were let into the moss, and the butterfly riders tied their merry little pens to the flowers with spider threads, so that they might refresh themselves with the flower sap. Now the funniest games began. Elves danced on stretched spider threads, little girls walked on rolling dewdrops. A fat dwarf balanced a mullein in his belt. Elves climbed up, and at the top stood a little boy on tiptoe. It was a feat of strength, and they all clapped their hands and cried, "Bravo! Bravo!" Then fighting games were performed. 12 men from the Hishke Varieterai fought with 12 men from the lizard riders. How bravely they struck at each other. The small sabres clinked, and the blows fell like hail on the flashing tanks. The stag beetles fought eagerly with them and pinched the poor lizards quite miserably with their hard pincers. One of them had grabbed a lizard by the tail. The latter tried to flee in spite of all spurs, but the rider had turned around and was defending himself against the stag beetle rider. He proved that he knew how to fight even in flight. Now an air battle followed. Then the light riders whizzed through the air on their nimble butterflies, now on top of each other, now under each other. It was a colourful turmoil. Yes, sometimes one of them fell to the ground, but like lightning he was on his feet again, mounted another little horse, and was again in the midst of it. Now it was time to dance. That used to be strange music. Then the dwarfs came tottering with hose on their shoulders and little blue lights on their heads. Each had a flashing gem or a piece of shimmering ore in his hand. They formed a circle, then danced to the middle and put the stones all in a pile. Then they danced about with strange leaps, while they sang with growling voices to the beat of the music, stamping their feet frequently. Little dwarfs, deep in the mountain, must dig, have to hack and pluck themselves day and night, up and down, clip and clap, trot, trot. Little dwarfs, deep in the mountain. And, as they stamped and jumped, they gradually sank deeper and deeper into the ground. Soon only the bearded faces looked out. Then they sank completely, and only the blue flames still flickered in the places where they had disappeared. One could still hear the strange song, quite muffled under the earth. Drap, drap, up and down, digging, hoeing. Drap, drap, up and down, digging, hoeing. Now came again a light, funny music. Then all the elves took long-stemmed flowers in their hands and floated and danced gracefully together, with the fair queen in the middle. Above it, like a colourful cloud, fluttered the shimmering butterflies. The elves sang softly and gracefully, dancing, floating, lovely life, elves in the night, dancing, floating, lovely life, until the young day awakens. And as Herman looked at the colourful throng, it seemed to him as if it was becoming more and more indistinct before his eyes, as if a veil had been drawn over it. As if in a fog, he saw the dainty figures swaying in confusion, and as if from a distance he heard the singing, dancing, floating, lovely life. Elves in the night, dancing, floating. Then all was silent, and like a dark veil, it sank before his eyes. When he opened his eyes again, it was morning, and he was lying quite neatly in his bed. The clock struck 8 from the nearest church tower. He rubbed his forehead, sat up in bed, and looked at his ink barrel. It stood on the table and looked no different than usual. When he had risen and approached his table, he was surprised, for the whole sheet of paper which he had laid before him the night before was closely written and by a fine hand. When he began to read what he had written, he found that it was a very exact description of the fairy festival. Then the poor student realized what a treasure the old man had given him. He immediately set out to visit him and thank him for his gift. But when he came to the street where he had found him, there was no such house to be found in the whole street, and he never saw the old junk dealer again. But still, on many an evening, he put the ink barrel on the table, laid a sheet of paper before him, took the pen in his hand, and then the strange fairy tales happened. The children who lived in the house, however, had it very well, for in the evening, when it was dark, they came to Herman and sat around him, and then he told them all these beautiful stories. You would probably like to hear them now. Yes, if I learn more about the poor student and his wonderful ink barrel, I will tell you again. You may depend upon it. Holiday Tales for Cozy Nights start on December 1st and run until December 26th. If you like these stories, subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss any new stories in the future.